Hello and welcome to Control F, the NSI Cyber and Tech Center's podcast that features a season-long groupings of issues at the intersection of technology and national security. Our first season of Control F is focused on game-changing technologies through a set of 8 episodes released every other week over the course of 4 months that take a deep dive into key emerging technologies that are reshaping our world and the ever-evolving tech policy landscape alongside them. During each episode this season, Control F, we're featuring one or more leading technical experts in a given field, as well as one or more key investors funding the development of these critical technologies. So today, we'll be talking about the concepts of secure by design and resilience by design. These twin concepts are aimed at integrating security and resilience into system development, emphasize the importance of building systems that are both secure from birth and also capable of rapidly recovering from disruptions. I'm joined by 2 fantastic experts in the field today to unpack how secure by design and resilient by design systems work and how these concepts are changing the way we address security considerations, including the national security domain. First up is Barmak Meftah. He's the co-founder and general partner of Ballistic Ventures, a venture capital firm focused on funding and incubating innovations in cybersecurity. Globally recognized as a successful leader in enterprise software and cybersecurity, Barmak has a distinguished career marked by transformative leadership. Before founding Ballistic, Barmak was the president of AT&T Cybersecurity, a position he took on following the successful acquisition by AT&T of AlienVault. As CEO of AlienVault, Barmak positioned the company as a market leader in unified security management and open source threat intelligence. His strategic vision and leadership at AT&T Cybersecurity cemented its status as a top 5 global managed security services provider. Prior to his time at AlienVault, Barmak served as the vice president of enterprise security at HP, following HP's acquisition of Fortify Software, where he was chief product officer and one of Fortify's first employees. His career also includes several senior management roles at Oracle, including as head of products for the Windows platform in Oracle's Server Technologies Group. Barmak holds a BSc in computer science with a minor in math and an MSc in computer science from the University of San Francisco. Next up, not to be trifled with, is Sounil Yu, himself a distinguished cybersecurity expert, author, and speaker, who currently serves as the co-founder and CTO of Knostic, a company that provides need-to-know access controls for generative AI, ensuring personalized and secure responses from large language models by tailoring answers to each employee's context in an enterprise scenario. With over a decade of experience in cybersecurity, Sounil is the creator of the DIE Triad and the Cyber Defense Matrix, 2 groundbreaking frameworks that have reshaped how organizations approach security in the cyber domain. Sounil regularly shares his insights at conferences and through various publications, often focusing on the integration of AI, machine learning, and automation and security. Sounil is also a fellow at our very own GMU's NSI and Cyber and Tech Center, something we're going to loop Barmak into as well, and has a long-standing commitment to advancing cybersecurity knowledge and practices. In addition to his roles at Knostic, Sounil recently authored his first book, The Cyber Defense Matrix, The Essential Guide to Navigating the Cybersecurity Landscape, a comprehensive guide to understanding and managing security capabilities. Sounil has a BS in Electrical Engineering and Economics from Duke, don't hold that against him, and an MS in Electrical Engineering from Virginia Tech. You can count him on that one. All right, folks, let's get started. So, Barmak, Sounil, I'm going to start with you, actually. Talk to us about the core principles that are behind these ideas of secure by design and resilience by design, and how do they differ from one another?
Sure. So I actually have a pretty distinct view on this, and you hit upon it earlier in terms of this thing that I introduced to the world called the DIE Triad. So when it comes to secure by design, one of the things that most of us understand when it comes to security is this notion of the CIA Triad, trying to address the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the system. And so when we think about secure by design, I think one of the fundamental perspectives is how do we ensure that systems are built to address the CIA of the system.
Right.
Resilience by design, on the other hand, I think focuses on a different set of principles. And these principles is what I call the DIE Triad. And DIE stands for distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. And if you have a system that is more distributed, more immutable, more ephemeral, it turns out it's more resilient as well. So what's interesting, though, is there's another interesting pattern that emerges, which is the more DIE your system is, it turns out the less CIA you require. Okay, so in other words, if you make something more distributed, you need less availability. You need to worry less about availability. If you have something that's very immutable, then you need to worry less about integrity. And if you have something that's very ephemeral, you need to worry less about confidentiality.
Does that mean if you're more resilient by design, you need less security by design?
And yes, so that is what is an interesting dichotomy that has emerged. This notion that how do you actually have a system that is both secure and resilient? Rather, should we aim for one And when when you aren't able to accomplish one of them, then you fall back to the other. So the real question then is, should you, if they happen to be opposite of each other, what do we shoot for first? Should we shoot for DIE first, or should we shoot for CIA first? And so this notion of secure by design suggests, okay, that from the very beginning, you make something more CIA, i.e. more secure. But I'm actually offering a different view, which is, what if resiliency is actually a different direction, an opposite direction almost, and we should shoot for that first? Because if you design systems to be more resilient, more DIE, then you lessen your burden for what you have to CIA.
Interesting. So, Barmak, what do you think about that? I mean, this idea that if you build systems to be more resilient, I mean, there's a sort of intuitive, concept to it, right? If it's more resilient, who cares if your security is that good? Because, if it goes down, it's attacked, whatever, you're able to come back fast and well. Although I wonder if somebody's stealing the stuff, right, don't you lose it? And does resiliency really help if the data's walked out the back door? I'm sure Sounil has a theory about this, but Barmak, what do you make of this concept of sort of DIE versus CIA? And if you have resilience, maybe you don't need as much security. Does that sound right? I mean, you've operated in space for a long time.
Yeah, concept near and dear to my heart. You might remember, Jamil, Ted Schlein, Roger Thornton, and I, two of my partners, started Fortify Software 22 years ago almost. Yeah. And the idea behind Fortify, which was kind of one of the first static analysis, what's today known as static application security testing, basically what Gartner calls it, was you want to build security into the fabric of the application of the software at the time that the software is being designed, developed. Mm-hmm. And I actually think sort of there's this concept of security in depth, which is, ideally you want one augmenting the other, in that you obviously want to build and deploy software in a resilient way. So you have to think about disaster recovery. You have to think about, I think the big issue right now with disaster recovery is keeping track of state, not just falling back on, things that you've backed up, et cetera. So there's a lot of architectural concepts that come into question to think about how do you architect software and deploy it in a way that that you can recover from a potential exploit. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the adversary, we live in a world in cybersecurity where the adversary has to be right only once, and they're going to choose the time of the attack. And there's this old sort of, attacker's dilemma, which is we have to be right all the time, and we have to predict how they're going to attack us. Mm. And so just as we figure out all the threat vectors and we build resilient software around those threat vectors, there's going to be new threat vectors that are going to be invented. And so you're always ex post facto sort of behind the attacker a little bit. I still would assert that you want to adopt secure by design principles during the software development life cycle, starting with the design of the software. So thinking about threat case models, sort of abuse case models of how the software could be potentially abused. I think concepts of static analysis, dynamic analysis, runtime analysis, all are fundamental to ensuring that security is built into the fabric of the software as much as you can. And then, of course, if you augment it with an architecture deployment model that's completely resilient, you sort of minimize. You still don't completely eliminate the risk of the software being breached, but you certainly minimize the probability of the software being breached.
Yeah. So Sounil, I mean, your argument I think is a little different though, right? Which is that you can limit the amount of security by being super resilient, but neither of you is saying it goes to zero, right? Mm-hmm. And so then the question, I guess, is it? Do you? I think Barmak laid out, so I think the more traditional view, and I think the view that sort of DHS has put out there, right, which is build secure by design first, then build resiliency in as well, do both. You're sort of, I think, arguing a little bit of the opposite, which is if you do more resiliency, you can really reduce that secure by design piece. Is that right? And if so, where's the delta between you two, if there is a delta? Maybe there isn't.
Yeah, and let me give you a perspective going back to the Fortify days. Back then, this whole notion of shifting left made sense because you would invest the time cycle, the cycle for how quickly you build software would be in months, in some cases years, which is sad for many companies. But the time cycle for deploying software nowadays is in days and weeks in terms of these sprints. And so design choices that you make early on in these longer time cycles have much more significant costs back in the day when Barmak was running Fortify. Today, you can make a bad design choice, and the penalty for that is potentially just 2 weeks worth of effort. Now, there's tech debt and all these other sort of things that factor in as well. But the perspective of the way we're building the way we're building software today gives us the opportunity to build them more resiliently because we can go iterate through much faster. And I think that's the difference here. Now, at the same time, let me also go back to your question about how do we balance the two? At the end of the day, there are always things that we're going to have to secure. And one of the ways I've characterized this is using a cloud native analogy around pets and cattle. We have pets, and those are things like legacy systems. Those are things that live a long time. Those things need to be CIA'd. We will always have pets. We will always have pets. We will always have pets. The other hand, we have things like cattle. Cattle are things that you don't have. And by the way, this is not my analogy. This is analogy from the cloud native world. But cattle are things that don't even have a name. And if it gets sick, you shoot it and you move on. And these are the cattle you design to be DIE. And cattle are resilient by design, whereas you want pet to be secure by design. A system consists of both pets and cattle. The question is, how many pets do you actually want? What's the distribution of pets to cattle in this particular system? Yeah. And the more pets you have, the more security burden you end up with. And so the goal is how do you design your system overall so that you have as few pets as possible so you can focus and dedicate your time and security energy to those pets, and all the rest of the cattle you just don't care about.
Yeah, I remember the first time you used this pets and cattle analogy with me. We were at Black Hat last year, and we were sitting downstairs in one of the hotels. I think that where DEF CON was taking place, and you laid out this idea for me. But Barmak, I'm interested to know: do you think? I mean, for one, do you buy this pets cattle analogy? And if you do, is it the case that higher priority systems, right, the sort of the critical systems you need for your company, or the TS SCI systems in the government, the national security domain, are there always going to be more pets, less cattle? And if so, are we really going to solve the security burden through resilience, or at least solve a big chunk of it? Because at the end of the day, if your crown jewels are always going to be more pets than cattle, right? Are we just shifting where the security burden is? And maybe we're lessening it overall, but it's not really, at the end of the day, for your high priority systems, a massive change.
Yeah. So there's two concepts that Sounil brings up that are actually important. One has to do with the risk exposure and the risk profile of, I would argue, not just application software, but any piece of IT, which I think where a lot of enterprises probably aren't smart in their security approach is risk-based security spend or risk-based security architecture, which is, look, prior to getting into anything that's cyber related, I think it's best for boards and the CISOs to assess the risk exposure of any IT asset and sort of spend apropos to that risk exposure. And risk acceptability for every enterprise is not the same. I mean, somebody that's a highly regulated financial services company might have a very low risk tolerance, whereas somebody down market might have a higher risk tolerance. So I think the first concept in general in cyber, forget about secure by design software, et cetera, is it'd just be great to get risk assessment done first and then present that to the board and have the board actually opine on risk acceptability and sort of make the board and your CEO part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So you're basically taking care of risk as a team, as opposed to CISO being the only sole accountable party to be able to assess risk and then essentially say what's acceptable risk. And I think if you do a good job of that, then you're going to start to assess which assets in IT, software included, you're going to be more OCD about in terms of secure in depth and cyber in depth, and which assets in IT you want to spend, again, more apropos to the risk exposure of that asset. And you can't paint all these assets with the same brush ultimately. That's one axis. The other axis pertaining to software has to do with what cycle in software development are you in? So there's a lot of software that's in deployment, very antiquated, that actually run a lot of the business critical parts of an organization. And unfortunately, you can't apply a lot of the secure by design principles because those software that software's already been assembled, has already been developed. And so you start looking for more resiliency at runtime and more observability at runtime vis-a-vis instrumentation. Whereas, look, there's a lot of new internal LLMs being developed. You're embarking on AI tech internally in the enterprise. A lot of new applications are being commissioned. And I would argue to the extent you have high-risk applications that are in the infancy and on the ascendancy of development, it'll just be good to think about the secure by design principles at the time that the software is being developed, so you don't fall behind when the software is already done.
And let me add something here. I think one of the things that we will oftentimes confuse in the security by design and resiliency by design, there are some design principles I think that are applied to both. So for example, regardless of whether you're doing security by design or resiliency by design, like logging and observability should be common for both. We want logging and observability for both. Strong authentication. Well, why?
I get it for security, but why resilience? Why do you need logging for resilience?
Well, it turns out this is not even the logging and observability is usually not a security thing. Usually it's the people who are the operations side of it who want to know how things are running. Because you want to know if the biggest concern is not a security concern. The biggest concern is my application actually working and delivering what it needs to deliver.
Right.
So there's already a natural business incentive to have logging and observability. And the more that we have, the more it also supports security as well.
Right.
I think the other thing, Jamil, I was going to say is incumbent upon us as venture capitalists and as operators to make the life of the developers a lot easier. So remember, software development, developers don't wake up every morning saying, I got to solve this security problem. They're incentivized to ship software on time and in a more accelerated pace because their job is to ultimately enable the business. And so often as security professionals, all we're thinking about is what's the best way to solve the cyber problem. I think you have to juxtapose it with how do we make the insertion points of software development pretty easy. So the lower the barrier of developers adopting security organically, the higher the adoption rate. And so I think that becomes kind of a critical thing for us to think through.
Yeah, it's the same thing with lawyers. Like lawyers are always viewed as a break-on business, right? And the lawyers you want to keep, right, are the ones who lean forward, help the business do its job. And the same thing is true of security professionals, right? If they can help make it easy, light touch the developer, and help the developer ship a faster, better product that's going to be more resilient, everyone wins in that scenario, right? The question is, how do we do that? And so I'm interested to know, and Sounil, I know you had something to say, but Barmak, I'm just stay with you for a second. What's the investment thesis in this space, right? Like, is there an opportunity here for investors to say, well, if we can create the technology you're describing, right, or fund the technology you're describing, which makes it easier for software developers to do security fast, to train them on it, to get them up, get them tested faster, and the like is that a viable investment thesis? And if so, how are you all thinking about that at Ballistic?
Yeah, huge. So, we have a thematic investment sort of thesis around, what's in the industry known as shift left. We call it security from the inside out kind of thing, which was something we invented 21 years ago at Fortify. But, just to give you a couple examples, Pangea Cyber, actually the company founded by Oliver Friedrichs, our friend, focuses on providing the microservices and APIs for developers to be able to build cyber features into their applications so they don't have to reverse engineer a lot of these features required, and they can just grab the APIs and basically they can use the APIs. So think authentication, authorization, secure audit log, redact, embargo. There's a variety of security features that every application has to have, and if you don't have a consistent set of APIs to be able to grab that already implement the security features, you have to do it on your own. And it's a point of friction that developers face on an ongoing basis. This company is bringing the friction down by virtue of providing those APIs for you. In fact, one of the things they've done that's really cool is plugged under the GitHub Copilot and VS Code. So as code is being generated, you sort of have these APIs already there. There's an investment we have in a company called Oligo that provides the observability at runtime when the application is running. So you can actually see the exploitability and the traceability of what's actually happening in runtime. So you don't focus on lower priority or unapproachable, unexploitable call paths in an application. You can sort of focus on higher priority items. So big investment thesis for us around how do we make DevOps and development part of the solution, and the only way you make them part of the solution is lower the barrier of adoption for them and make these tools that are cyber focused super easy for them to adopt. So that thesis is going to continue to fund too for us as AI is now becoming more prevalent, where we think enterprises are going to build a lot of these LLM systems internally.
Yeah.
No, I think
So,
that's
what do you, I mean, what do you make of that? One, do you buy the sort of the investment thesis, and if so, are there other areas we should be thinking about, particularly as we think about your DIE concept and resilience by design, and the potential that has to lower the need for security to get developers in that space as well?
Yeah, so I have literally bought into this because I was actually an early investor in Build.security, which was sort of like a predecessor to Pangea as well, in creating these paved paths or these primitives that developers can use. And interestingly enough, I'm also an advisor to Oligo, and I've actually gave them the idea that we just talked about in terms of defining what is expected out of these out of the software that we have, so that we can then it becomes easier for us to see when unusual behavior occurs. At the end of the day, one of the challenges that we so now living in the space where I'm building product from ground up, I have to tell you, it is much harder than it seems to build to integrate security into the design of a system. And the reason why, I'm going to blame folks like Barmak here, which is
all right. Here we go. Now this is where it gets fun.
yeah. So we need to keep like the goal here is to sell product and build MVP and to do whatever. Okay, and the key principle that allows us to drive that forward is keep it simple, stupid. Okay. And the challenge with security is security almost immediately creates complexity. When you want to delay complexity as long as possible, because too much complexity too early can kill a startup. And in some respects, if I had this long path to be able to deliver product and do whatever, then yeah, sure, I can account for all this complexity. But the pressures of business drive us towards how do we keep things as simple
and
yes,
venture capital.
And so that's really the challenge. How do we balance this? Now, I think that's why I'm in huge favor of companies like Pangea and again Build earlier, because those primitives make it simple. It allows developers to say, you know what? It's like Stripe, right? Stripe offloaded the whole PCI requirement. It was very complex to do PCI, and now it's an API call. It was really complex to do SSL certificates, and Let's Encrypt made it stupid easy. Right, super simple, and these sort of paved paths, these sort of mechanisms, I think will help us long term to integrate security into the design phase, because it's just it's like a built-in part of the infrastructure. It's not something that you have to tack on afterwards.
Yeah, and so Barmak, what about that? I mean, what about this idea that you've got to it's harder than it seems. The pressures of being a venture-backed startup. And just being a going concern make it such that baking the stuff in is hard. And yes, it's great that we have these tools and capabilities that might make it that much easier. But let's be real. I mean, at a seed, pre-seed, Series A company, when the IP is most vulnerable to nation-state actors, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, it's hard for these guys to make their own systems secure, much less the software they're building and trying to get out the door and try to get to their design partners and make better and better so that investors will put money behind it. I mean, it's hard to make that in. It's hard to make resilience in. So does there need to be a fundamental change, putting aside whether we invest in capabilities, which I think makes sense, right, to make it easier for developers? Does there need to be a change in the mentality of the investors that say, we need you, we want you, there's an investment benefit to us in you building your software, both secure and resilient by design? And if so, is that a mindset change amongst all venture capitalists, or just the select few that think security is really important?
Yeah, I think you can have your cake and eat it too. So I agree with Sounil. I think security has been complicated for no other reason than innovation hasn't caught up with the realities of security adoption. So, again, as security professionals and investors, we have a single lens of everything has to be secure at any cost. And I think that's come at the expense of low friction products, easy to use products. And there's no computer science impediment to building good cyber controls that are also low friction and easy insertion points, and you can get up and running in 5 to 10 minutes. So, a core part of our investment thesis is looking at opportunities that have an enduring value, that are IPOable, that can grow into adjacent areas that are not features. But a critical part of what we do our tech due diligence on is it a product that can be self-installed, self-evaluated? And everybody talks about PLG. I don't necessarily buy into a full cycle of PLG in cybersecurity where somebody tries security controls and swipes a credit card and buys it. I mean, that's yet to be seen. It hasn't happened yet. But I absolutely buy into what I call PLG assisted, which is what you don't want to do ideally is start the sales cycle top down, go to the CISO, start this elongated 4-week sort of POC that's very complicated, and then require a 6-month PS implementation for security control. And that I think is an innovation of the past. Innovation of the future would be one that technical buyers start their technical journey themselves with security control, see the inherent value of the security control, and then drive the acquisition up to the economic buyer saying, look, we already went through this evaluation on our own or at least with minimal assistance from the vendor. And that's something we see inherent value, and the economic buyer becomes more of an enabler for them rather than these long POCs and long PS implementations. So I guess the point being, technical elegance is not just how awesome your cybersecurity control is, but how easy it is to insert that security control in software development, in IT, in DevOps, depending on what you're trying to build. So that becomes a critical part of why we invest in those type of companies.
Yeah, and so for those of you who don't know, product-led growth, PLG, is what Barmak is talking about there. But so Barmak, help me understand that though. If what we're talking about is fundamentally a security buyer, a technical buyer, buying this capability, installing it, sort of try to buy, and then convincing the economic buyer, the bosses, to put money behind this. I mean, that is sort of like a swipe and try, although not for the the boss, right? But how do can security really be that easy? I mean, you made a claim, right, that security doesn't have to be hard, security doesn't have to be complicated. Maybe we've all just overcomplicated it, but I mean, how do you do that? That creating what you described seems hard itself. Otherwise, presumably somebody would have done it, Fortify or somebody else, right? Isn't it hard?
No. So there's no technical impediment to any security. And God knows, Jamil, we look at hundreds of deals every year, and we only invest maybe 8 deals a year, right? And there is no security control that I can think of that has to be architecturally hard to implement, right? The issue with PLG, or product-led growth, is this. It's not so much so the technical architecture of how easy it is to get a product up and running. I think you got to make it super simple. I think the insertion points have to be simple. And I fundamentally think if the technical buyer and the technical user can't see inherent value in the product, no amount of top-down selling and taking the economic buyer to steak and wine and sort of showing a good time is gonna really. It might be a short-term high to get a big deal out of him, but what you're going to find is the software is going to sit on the shelf because the technical buyers don't see value.
It is the way a lot of security has been sold for the last 2 decades or 3 decades, right?
But a big shift is occurring over the last 6-7 years where technical teams are really getting empowered, saying, "Look, I want to choose my own product. I don't want to be told which product I have to use. I have to choose my own product." But there is a big difference between seeing technical value in a proof of concept to the acquisition cycle. So the acquisition cycle, ultimately, look, if I'm the chief information security officer of a company and I'm about to sign a 400K ARR deal, 500K ARR deal, in the end, I want to meet the vendor. I want to shake their hand. I want to know who my trusted partner is, et cetera. So the idea of going through a pure product-led growth, which is credit card swiped, few and far between happens here and there. But that doesn't preclude a technical, architectural, elegant approach to have low insertion, have the technical buyer enjoy it, and at some point in time have the rep go shake the hand of the CISO and say, here's who we are, here's our financial backing, here's the number of customers we have, et cetera, and it's a good bet. And so you still need that touch with the economic buyer, but there's no impediment to making products easier to use. I mean, it's just there just isn't.
Yeah, I think we have to think about, in that regard, that where I've seen PLG really succeed is when you're delivering capability for the main user of not the security product, but whatever it is that the security product is actually wrapping around. We typically talk about PLG in the context of developers, and developers are slinging code, and they love tools that help them become more efficient as developers. A great example that I point to oftentimes is something like SemGrep. SemGrep is a tool that developers actually want to use because it helps them do linting and other things that is core to their job. Oh, and by the way, it also has these security features that are wonderful too. Okay, so I think first and foremost, it's the developer sees a reason for why they would want to use this as a part of their day-to-day, and it just happens to have security features. And that same story plays out when it comes to other technical users, as Barmak described it, whether it's people who operate in cloud, okay, which also happens to be developers, but let's just say other members of the team that are part of cloud operations. But let's also extend that to SaaS for a moment. So SaaS, the owner of the SaaS application is not security, right? It's not even in many cases IT. It's some part of the business that needed this particular application. And let's say now we want to secure the SaaS application. Well, you're going to have a lot of resistance if that owner of that application feels like it's just burden. It's more a burden and going to create more work for them. But if there is some feature or something that makes their job much more efficient at actually accomplishing the core reason why they are using the SaaS application, oh, and by the way, it also does security, then that's the PLG motion that many companies are looking for. And that's what they want. With SaaS, it's a little harder because your total addressable market on a per application basis may be small, unless you're talking like Office 365. But the aggregate is much bigger. The aggregate, though, has to be a top-down sort of motion. That's why things like SSPM, I think, come at the top-down sort of view.
But tell us what SSPM is.
Oh, sorry. SaaS Security Posture Management, where you're trying to...
SaaS being software as a service.
Software, yes. So that sort of view requires you to take a top-down view because you're saying, I'm looking at the entire SaaS footprint of my environment.
Not just one application.
Not just one. Yeah. But if you really want to try to drive adoption, then the goal is to look at it from the person who's actually using the tool, using the application, and bring value to them first, and then they'll make the case going up.
Here's a great example in SSPM. So so SemGrep, by the way, I'm a big fan. Both me and my partner individually invested in them early on with Isaac and Drew, and I think they've built a great company. We have an investment in a company called Nudge Security. Nudge is in the shadow IT SSPM space. And to your point, Sounil, they essentially look at SaaS services that employees have subscribed to, but it's outside the purview of the enterprise. So the enterprise doesn't have a clue what they've subscribed to, et cetera. It is probably in our entire portfolio the easiest product to get started with. It's probably the epitome of all PLGs that are out there, where you install their product, you don't even know it's there. It starts to scan your emails, because what happens when you subscribe to a SaaS service, there's typically an email that's come to you that says, this is what you've subscribed to, authentication. It's going to pick up behind the scenes all the SaaS services that you've subscribed to, and using nudge theory will sort of nudge the employee towards the direction of making them part of the solution, and letting them sort of tell the enterprise that these are the stuff that I've subscribed to. So you can get up and running with this thing within 5-10 minutes, and you can have a global view of all the SaaS services that you've basically signed up for. At some level of acquisition, once it starts getting into 6 figures and 7 figures, they're going to involve the economic buyer saying, boy, we love this product. We just got started 3 months ago. I tell you guys, it is probably the most efficient, easiest way to sell software, especially security, into an enterprise. Not just Nudge, but this idea that you just want to empower the people that ultimately want to get value out of the product. Some might be developers, some are in IT, some are in DevOps, some are actually economic buyers, like GRC solutions are sold to the executives. But you just want the persona that you're selling to derive value on their own before you start involving the economic buyer. And I just think that's a more efficient way to sell into an enterprise.
Yeah, no, I totally buy that. I think it's interesting though. So it is interesting that you have now this capability to know what your folks have bought before they even tell you, right? And identifying the shadow IT in the form of SaaS software. Because it's one thing to find shadow IT, to find those boxes you didn't know on your network, right? Or the software that's on your own devices, but knowing somebody's running SaaS in the cloud, right? I think that's a really interesting play. So Sounil, I want to come back to this question of how we think about pets and cattle in high priority systems, right? So one of the things we always talk about on this podcast is the national security nexus of some of this technology, right? How is this stuff being used in the government? How is it being used in the intelligence community and the Department of Defense? I can't think of a place where it's more important that you build secure by design and resilient by design, one or both, or whether resilience comes first or whatever, right? Than the DoD or the intelligence community. But it strikes me as well that, this is a place where, and again, and maybe I get this wrong, so I want you to tell me if I'm getting the pets v. cattle concept wrong. It feels like in these higher priority systems, the top secret, sensitive compartment information facilities and the systems that drive it, the computers at NSA and DoD that do, encryption and do nuclear modeling. I mean, it seems to me those are going to be a lot more pets and a lot less cattle. And if that's right, then your security spend is still going to remain high. And you're still going to spend a lot of time protecting those systems. Is that right, or am I missing something here?
Unfortunately, that is the case. And let's also understand one interesting dynamic about pets and cattle. The longer lived a cattle is, the more it looks like a pet. Okay? And we can say that about data as well. So data, the longer lived it is, the more it looks like a pet. If you consider some of the principles around privacy by design, what is the goal of privacy by design? It's so that if this data is ever exposed, stolen, whatever else it might be, I don't actually care. Okay? If I actually do care, then it's not, the data itself is not adhering to privacy by design, and thus it must be CIA'd. Okay. So how do we apply this in the context of national security things? There are going to be, unfortunately, there's just going to be things that will, well, actually, the fact that it's marked top secret means that that's pet data right there. Right there, you've already declared it to be a pet, and it has to be secured like a pet. And unfortunately, we continue to accrue more and more, which means that we continue to have to dedicate more and more resources to, well, actually, we need to have more veterinarians. Okay? But what if we invested in more pet control officers? What if we invested in people who said, or whose job was primarily to say, do we really need this pet? Is this cattle that might become a pet, what can we do to get rid of it? Yeah. What can we do to avoid a situation where now this content has to become maintained? Okay.
Classified, right? Or kept, right?
Yes, or kept. And I think that's really the challenge. And I think for those who've been in the national security space, we also know there's a lot of things that are overclassified. A lot of things that are overclassified. Sure. Or we unnecessarily putting more energy into protecting pets that really shouldn't be pets to begin with.
Well, it's hard to tell people. I mean, this it's so funny because I think the analogy works so well, right? It's hard to tell anybody who has a pet or thinks they have a pet, right, that your pet isn't really a pet. It's really a cow, and you can really kill it, and it'll all be fine. Somebody's like, I've got this great compartmented program that I've had for 10 years, and yes, it doesn't produce anything today, but I really love my cute little program. I mean, this is really how it works in government, right? So how do you, I mean, you literally need sort of pet control officers that are authorized to shoot the pets. I mean, look, nobody's shooting pets. Let's be clear, right? None of us are governors who would prefer to shoot their dogs. Super weird, by the way. Who talks about that? It's crazy to me. We're not getting political here. It's just cyber. But crazy, anyways. But it sounds like we do need more of those sort of, tell the person that your pet's not a pet anymore, right?
Yeah, and once you have a pet, it's hard to. I mean, it is.
Let go.
Yeah, it's hard to let go. It's not a COVID pet. You can't just give it away and hope that someone else will take care of it. It is yours forever. You have to give it love and care and attention, and it's what you're signing up for. The challenge here is: are you doing this knowingly? Are you knowingly signing up for it, making sure that the owner of the pet comes with budget for veterinary care, that there's clear ownership and authorities as to who can make that decision as to when you put it down, or are we just doing this accidentally because we're not keeping the proper controls in place?
I want to state for the record, Jamil, that my French bulldog Oliver is connected to me at the hip, and I'll spend ungodly amounts of dollars, including my homes and all our wealth, to keep him alive and healthy. So,
listen,
we're pet lovers here, and I love my Frenchie.
Believe you me, I have 3 dogs: a beagle, a foxhound, and a newly discovered somebody else's COVID pet, Bichon Frise. So believe you me, I got 3 of them. We would do anything to keep those dogs alive, and they're the best.
But if you had 50 of them, yeah, at some level, your life has changed.
I do also have my preferred compartmented programs as well. So I'm also a pet keeper in that way as well. But Barmak, we started with Sounil, so I want to end with you because we're running short on time. But I do want your take on this question of secure by design and resilience by design in the national security context. You were the CEO of AT&T Cybersecurity. Talk to us about how we need to think about this. Is it true we're just going to end up? We're just going to have to spend more on security in this domain, because at the end of the day, it's so high priority, it's so important. It's like the crown jewels of a company. You're always going to spend that money. You're always going to CIA it, in Sounil's terms. Is that right? And if so, how can investors, or how should investors think about selling into the government? Is it the same old thing, or do they need this new way of thinking about it as well as they're doing in the enterprise space?
Gosh, that's a loaded question. Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think there's probably two parts to what you asked, Jamil, which is, well, probably three parts. How should an entrepreneur think about selling into the federal government, whether it's intelligence agency or DoD, and at what stage of the company should they start thinking about that? And for the vast majority of cyber companies, except but for the ones that are what we call federal technology, which is they start their footprint in the federal government. Yeah. They want to go the opposite way, which is few and far between. I don't recommend to the entrepreneurs to start approaching the federal government until they're probably 10 to 20 million of revenue. They've found primary demand in the commercial market, and they've found their ICP. They have product market fit, only because the government sales cycles are so long, and so you've got to you've got to find a good FSI. You got to start to build your GSA schedule. You got to find the folks that could effectively sell and advertise your solution to the federal government. So from the time you start investing to sell into the federal government, you should realistically forecast 18, 24 months before you see the first dollar coming out of the federal government. So you got to be smart about when you go after the federal government. I think with regards to your second question, which is when it comes to national security, how should you think about secure by design and resilience by design and all the concepts that we talked about? We're so fortunate that we have Ted Schlein, Kevin Mandy on our team. They both are very involved with the intelligence agency and the intelligence community in general. We have advisors on our board. General Paul Nakasone just joined our advisory board, and they inform us around how the federal government thinks about these things. And in general, what I found is this is one area that you don't want to cut corners at all. So it's one area that the last 1% is everything, because it's going to expose the attack surface that could potentially be exploited. So the idea of good enough security that might be very well received for the mid-market, small to medium-sized businesses, even up-market for some enterprise customers, is really not that acceptable when it comes, especially to the intelligence apparatus, to some extent in DoD. And so best of breed, covering the last 1% of the attack surface, ensuring that you've covered everything, is really key. Is really key. And so that to me is really essential.
And just to echo that, as Jamil, you mentioned, my company Knostic is focused on addressing a need-to-know problem. And I use that terminology because it certainly resonates with a certain community in government, right? But to Barmak's point, I am not touching government until we're ready at the points that he mentioned. I've been in government. I've sold in the government. It's an elephant that moves extraordinarily slowly, and it's only when you're ready to go that you should start trying to bite into the elephant.
Well, I mean, as you both know, that's such a bummer, right? Because we all want the best in breed and earliest technology in the government. But I think you're exactly right. I mean, if you're a startup innovator, you just can't afford the time and effort and work it takes. So you got to figure out when to make that move. And it's probably like you say, Barmak, make your bones in the enterprise world first, and then get it into government. So, all right, folks, that's a wrap. Thanks to both Sounil Yu from Knostic and Barmak Meftah from Ballistic Ventures for joining us today. And thank you to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI CTC staff for helping and producing today's episode. The Control-F podcast, including our game-changing technology series, is also on YouTube. So if you want to see our smiling faces, be sure to check out NSI's page on YouTube for a video of today's episode. And make sure to join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks, where we'll explore how differential privacy is transforming data analysis by enabling anonymized insights while also safeguarding individual privacy. And as always, if you like what you heard or saw on YouTube, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Have a great week.